Have you ever wondered if the story of Goliath hides a secret that only a few people know? The Bible tells us about the epic battle between David and the Philistine giant. But what if the story goes way deeper than we ever imagined? What if Goliath wasn't just a tall warrior, but part of a mysterious bloodline that traces back to ancient times, to the Nephilim, the giants of the past? Many believe Goliath was simply an extremely tall man, possibly due to a genetic condition like acromegaly. But what if there's more to it? The Bible mentions the Rephaim, the Anakim, and entire tribes of giants that seem to challenge God's divine plan. Where did they come from? How did their lineage survive after the Great Flood? And most importantly, why did God make sure these beings crossed paths with the people of Israel? Get ready to uncover some mind-blowing facts that might completely change how you see one of the Bible's most iconic stories. We're not just talking about David versus Goliath. We're diving into the real meaning behind the giants of the Bible. What's hidden in the story that so few dare to question? Stick around until the end, because the truth might be more shocking than you think. Goliath of Gath wasn't just another Philistine warrior. He was a literal giant, a walking nightmare who struck fear into even the bravest Israelites. Standing over 10 feet tall, his sheer size was enough to make anyone hesitate. His body was covered in armor, so heavy that an average man would struggle to even lift it. The tip of his spear alone weighed around 15 pounds, turning it into a battlefield weapon of destruction. Who would dare step forward to face such a monster in combat? Back then, war wasn't just about brute strength. It was psychological warfare too. And in that department, Goliath was a master. For 40 days, he stood in the valley, taunting the Israelites, daring just one warrior to come forward and fight him. But who in their right mind would accept a duel against a beast like that? Some scholars suggest that Goliath may have suffered from acromegaly, a condition caused by a pituitary tumor that could explain his gigantic size and incredible strength. Whatever the case, his towering figure and massive armor made him look like an unstoppable force on the battlefield. But if Goliath was so unbeatable, why did it take him so long to crush Israel once and for all? Maybe his biggest weakness was his overconfidence. He saw himself as a titan, untouchable, invincible, and that led him to underestimate his enemies. As he marched forward, mocking the Israelites and laughing at their faith, one young shepherd, David, listened carefully to every word. He wasn't a warrior. He didn't wear armor, but there was something burning inside him, an unshakable faith. And it was that faith that would change the course of history. Goliath wasn't just a giant in size. He was a giant in arrogance too. For 40 days straight, he marched to the front lines of the Philistine army and threw down a brutal challenge to the Israelites. If an Israelite warrior could defeat him, the Philistines would become Israel's servants. But if Goliath won, the Israelites would be enslaved. This kind of fight, known as a champion duel, wasn't uncommon in ancient times. It was a way to settle battles without massive bloodshed. But in this case, no one dared to step forward. Morning and night, Goliath stood in the valley, shouting insults at Israel and mocking their God. He laughed at King Saul's army, calling them cowards, and made sure to humiliate their faith. For the soldiers listening, it was a double blow. Not only were they terrified of the giant, but they also had to endure the shame of watching their God be ridiculed, without a single warrior brave enough to stand up for him. Even Saul, the king who was supposed to lead by example, was frozen in fear. If he, taller and more experienced than most, was too scared to face Goliath, then who else would even think about trying? While Israel's warriors trembled, a young shepherd walked into the battlefield. No armor, no sword, no fear. David wasn't even part of the army. He was just there to bring supplies to his brothers. But the moment he heard Goliath's words, something inside him ignited. To him, this wasn't just a battle between two nations. It was an offense against the living God. And if no one else had the courage to fight, he would. The battle hadn't even begun, but history was already being written. While Israel's soldiers hid behind their spears and shields, a young shepherd strolled to the camp unbothered. David wasn't a warrior, nor did he wear any armor. His world was the open fields, where he spent his days watching over sheep and fighting off predators with nothing but a sling and a handful of smooth stones. Sent by his father, Jesse, to bring food to his brothers and check on the war, David had no idea that this day would change the course of Israel's history forever. As soon as he arrived, he could feel the tension in the air. The soldiers were terrified, whispering about the Philistine giant who had been challenging them day after day. Curious, David moved closer and heard Goliath's thunderous voice echoing through the valley. The giant was laughing, taunting, daring anyone to step forward and fight him. But what truly enraged David wasn't the military threat. It was a spiritual insult. How could an uncircumcised Philistine dare to challenge the army of the living God? To the soldiers, Goliath was an unbeatable force. To David, he was just another obstacle in the way of God's plan. His brothers tried to shut him up, irritated by his boldness. "What are you even doing here? Go back to your sheep." But David didn't back down. He started asking about the reward for whoever defeated Goliath, and soon enough, word of his confidence reached King Saul. While the soldiers saw just an inexperienced boy, God saw a warrior ready for the fight. And that's how a simple shepherd found himself face to face with one of the greatest giants in history. When David was brought before King Saul, most people expected him to back down the moment he realized the size of the challenge ahead. But to everyone's surprise, the young shepherd stood firm. He wasn't intimidated by Goliath's towering figure or the mocking laughter around him. Instead, he told the king about his past battles, silent fights against lions and bears while protecting his sheep. If God had saved him from the jaws of those beasts, surely he would deliver him from the sword of this Philistine giant. David's confidence wasn't in his own strength. It was in the certainty that God would fight for him. Saul, still skeptical, tried to equip him with his own armor. But the king's armor was too heavy, too restrictive for someone used to the freedom of the open fields. David didn't need metal to protect him. His true defense was his faith. He went down to the stream and carefully picked up 5 smooth stones, placed it in his bag. His only weapon would be his sling, a simple tool, but deadly in the right hands. It was an unusual strategy. While Goliath relied on the weight of his armor and the power of his sword, David relied on precision, speed, and most importantly, divine providence. As he walked toward the battlefield, David could hear the giant's booming laughter. Goliath mocked him, calling him a mere boy and threatening to tear him apart. But David didn't flinch. He looked straight into the giant's eyes and declared with unshakable confidence, "You come against me with sword and spear, but I come against you in the name of the Lord of hosts." At that moment, the battle was already decided. The real difference between them wasn't just size or weaponry. It was perspective. Goliath put his faith in his own strength. David put his faith in something far greater. The battlefield fell silent as David stood before Goliath. No armor, no sword, just a sling and unshakable faith. The giant, full of arrogance, charged forward with his massive spear, certain that crushing this young challenger would be effortless. But while Goliath relied on the sheer weight of his armor, David trusted in his speed and accuracy. With one swift motion, he spun his sling and launched one of the smooth stones with incredible force. The impact was brutal. The stone struck Goliath's forehead, sinking deep into his skull. The giant collapsed face first into the ground. The Philistine army watched in stunned silence as their champion fell. The Israelites, who had been paralyzed with fear just moments before, now saw the impossible happen before their eyes. But David didn't hesitate. He ran toward Goliath's lifeless body, grabbed the giant's own sword, and without a second thought, cut off his head. It was a final blow, proof that the battle wasn't won by human strength, but by the hand of God. Fear now switched sides. The once mighty Philistines, who had felt invincible, now fled in terror. The Israelites, filled with renewed courage, charged after them, celebrating a victory that was only possible because of the faith and bravery of an unlikely shepherd. David's name echoed throughout Israel, and his victory marked the beginning of a new era. But the story didn't end there. After all, Goliath wasn't the only giant out there. Others still roamed among the Philistines, descendants of the ancient Rephaim. If one had fallen, who would be next? And was Goliath truly just an exceptional warrior, or was there something far more mysterious behind his lineage? Goliath's fall was just the beginning. Israel would soon realize that the giant David had defeated wasn't the only one of his kind. The Bible mentions that Goliath had brothers and other massive warriors among the Philistines, descendants of a fierce bloodline. Among them were Lami and Ishbi-Benob, along with other colossal enemies who would rise during David's time. But if Goliath, the mightiest of them all, had already been taken down, who would dare to face the rest? To everyone's surprise, David's own men took on that mission. One of the most legendary battles was fought by Elhanan, one of David's loyal warriors, who killed Lami, Goliath's brother. Ishbi-Benob, on the other hand, almost killed David himself in combat, but was taken down by Abishai, another mighty warrior of Israel. These giants weren't just exceptionally strong fighters. They reinforced the idea that an ancient and powerful lineage still existed among Israel's enemies. The Philistines weren't about to give up their war against God's chosen people, and the shadow of the giants still loomed over the battlefield. But who exactly were these giants? The Bible connects them to the Rephaim, a race of unusually tall people who lived in the region long before the Israelites arrived. Some scholars even suggest that this lineage could be linked to the Nephilim, mysterious beings mentioned in the book of Genesis, known for their immense strength and supernatural size. If Goliath and his brothers were part of this bloodline, then the war against the giants wasn't just a territorial conflict. It was a battle rooted in ancient times, full of mystery and deep spiritual implications. The origins of Goliath and his brothers have been debated for centuries. Were they simply men of extraordinary height, or were they the descendants of an ancient and enigmatic lineage? The Bible mentions the Nephilim in Genesis 6 verse 4, describing them as giants who lived on earth in the days before the Great Flood. These beings are often associated with the Rephaim, the massive warriors that Joshua and his men fought centuries before David's rise to power. If Goliath and his brothers were descendants of the Rephaim, that would mean their bloodline somehow survived the flood. The Bible provides several clues that support this connection. Deuteronomy mentions the Emim and Anakim, giant tribes that the Israelites encountered on their journey to the Promised Land. 1 Chronicles also references descendants of giants being slain by David's men. But what makes this theory even more intriguing is the meaning of the word Nephilim, which translates to fallen ones. Some scholars speculate that these creatures could have been linked to fallen angels, making them more than just physical adversaries. They could have been part of a spiritual battle, representing forces much greater than a simple war between nations. Regardless of the theory, one thing is clear. Giants kept appearing throughout biblical history, and one by one, they were defeated by the Israelites. But what if the explanation for their enormous size wasn't just theological? What if there was a scientific reason behind Goliath and his brother's gigantism? That's a question that modern researchers are still trying to answer, offering a new perspective on a mystery as old as the Bible itself. While the Bible describes Goliath and other giants as formidable warriors, some researchers suggest that their impressive height might have a medical explanation. One of the most widely accepted theories points to acromegaly, a condition caused by excessive growth hormone due to an overactive pituitary gland, resulting in gigantism. People with this condition tend to have elongated limbs, a prominent forehead, and often suffer from vision problems due to pressure on the optic nerve. Interestingly, this could explain why Goliath didn't see David clearly and underestimated the sling attack. Gigantism, caused by an excess of growth hormone, is well documented in modern medicine. Cases like Robert Wadlow, the tallest man in recorded history at 8 feet 11 inches, 2.72 meters, show how genetics can play a major role in extreme height. If Goliath and his brothers belonged to a lineage with a genetic predisposition for gigantism, it could explain why multiple generations of giants were recorded among the Philistines and other ancient tribes. Some studies even suggest that inbreeding among certain groups might have amplified these traits over centuries. But does this scientific explanation discredit the biblical narrative? Not at all. If anything, it adds more depth to the story. If Goliath suffered from a medical condition, it doesn't change the fact that he was a terrifying warrior and that his challenge to Israel was real. The story of David and Goliath isn't about biology or genetics. It's about faith, strategy, and overcoming the impossible. Still, this analysis raises another question. How did the giants in the Bible connect to the Great Flood? Were they all wiped out, or did some survive, giving birth to later legends? The Bible states that the Great Flood came to cleanse the earth of corruption. Among those inhabiting the world at that time were the Nephilim, described as giants and men of great renown. But if the flood was meant to wipe out these beings, How we explain the existence of Goliath and other giants centuries later. Some interpretations suggest that descendants of the Nephilim survived in some way, or that their bloodline reemerged after the flood, mixing with groups like the Rephaim, Anakim, and Emim, who later clashed with the Israelites. Other theories propose that post-flood giants weren't literal survivors, but rather descendants of human lineages prone to gigantism, passing down genetic traits that resurfaced during the time of Joshua, Samuel, and David. This theory aligns with the idea of acromegaly and hereditary gigantism, but also leaves the door open for supernatural interference. Some Jewish and Christian traditions suggest that the Nephilim weren't completely destroyed in the flood because their origins were tied to spiritual forces, allowing their presence on earth to persist in ways beyond human understanding. Regardless of the theory, one thing is clear. Giants remained a challenge for people of Israel, and stories of these beings appear in multiple ancient cultures worldwide. Egypt, Mesopotamia, and even some Native American traditions speak of giant rulers and warriors who once walked the earth. But what was the true role of these giants in biblical history? Were they just powerful warriors, or was their presence part of a deeper, divine narrative? The answer might lie in the very sacred texts, which describe epic battles and a higher purpose behind the rise and fall of these beings. Giants aren't just some random detail in the scriptures. They show up at key moments in Israel's history. The book of Deuteronomy mentions entire tribes of giants, like the Rephaim, Emim, and Anakim, who lived in Canaan before the Israelites arrived. When Joshua led the conquest of the Promised Land, he faced these tribes, carrying out God's command to remove them. Centuries later, 1 Chronicles records that descendants of these giants still exist among the Philistines, Goliath and his brothers, showing that their lineage survived for a long time. Looking at these passages from a historical perspective, we see that the giants weren't just a military threat. They were both a physical and spiritual challenge to God's promise for Israel. The fear that the Israelites felt when spying on the land of Canaan, described in Numbers 13:33, where they said they felt like grasshoppers compared to the Anakim, shows that these beings were feared not just for their size, but for what they represented, direct opposition to God's divine plan. But what truly set Israel apart from its enemies wasn't their strength or military power. It was their faith. David proved this when he defeated Goliath without a sword, trusting only in God. Joshua and Caleb proved it when they bravely entered the Promised Land, without fear of giants. The Bible teaches us that no matter how big our challenges are, whether it's Goliath or a personal struggle in today's world, victory is determined by faith, courage, and trust in God's plan. But have we really absorbed this lesson? And what can David's battle against Goliath teach us in modern times? Now that you know the truth behind Goliath and the giants of the Bible, the question is, what does this mean for us today? If David, a simple shepherd, could take down a giant with just a sling and a stone, what's stopping us from facing our own giants? Fear, doubt, struggles, we all have challenges that seem impossible. But David's story teaches us that physical strength doesn't win battles. Faith, courage, and strategy do. So, what giants have you been facing lately? Are you, like the Israelites, letting fear paralyze you? Or are you ready to pick up your sling, choose your stones, and step onto the battlefield? David's example isn't just an ancient story. It's a call to face challenges head-on, knowing that victory has already been declared. If this content resonated with you, don't forget to subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications so you don't miss future videos. There's a lot more coming about the Bible, ancient mysteries, and mind-blowing revelations that you won't want to miss. And of course, drop a comment below. What part surprised you the most? I'd love to hear your thoughts.